On the western edge of Montreal, there's this quiet little village called Senneville. Surrounded by French Quebec, this is a mostly English enclave. And there's big money here. But there's also retired teachers, like Jean Foster. She's invited my producer, Katie, into her home to tell her about when she was a graduate student in Montreal proper. Just, being young and having fun with her friends.
A friend of mine that I had gone to undergrad with, she and another friend, for some reason, they took this apartment not near any university in Montreal, a place that no students lived.
Montreal at the time was very divided. The English neighborhoods were very English. The French neighborhoods were mostly working class and poor. This was an English neighborhood, but not a fancy one.
It was an English place where at that time older people lived because actually that area was built for people who came back after the war and their families and that. So anyway, one weekend, my girlfriend, Joanne, who had the apartment, and her roommate was Tanya.
Fun fact about Tanya, she really liked pot.
Everyone was smoking pot, but you couldn't be caught even with the tizziest little bit of pot because you'd end up God knows what. I mean, she wasn't dealing it or anything, but it was a big deal then just to even have a little bit. So I knew Tanya did more than her fair share of this.
This story is going to be relevant to our national security podcast in a minute, I promise. But see, one weekend, Tanya was away, and Jean and Joanne wanted to go out, but Joanne's place was far, at least in student terms. So Jean remembers deciding to stay over at Tanya's place in her empty room.
And then, I have no idea what time it was in the morning, but I think it was fairly early. I was sound asleep, and I was woken up with a man flashing what turned out to be his ID, his police ID, in my face as I was lying in Tanya's bed. And all I could think of was, oh my God, they've caught Tanya for her pot. And so I'm lying in bed and this policeman is there flashing his police badge in front of my face. He said something obviously to wake me up. I didn't hear him coming into the room. And the first thing I did, my eyes went to her dresser, and I'm sure I looked guilty. And I thought, oh my God, is the pot on top of her dresser? Is it in the drawer? And he asked me some questions. Did I live here or something? And I said, no, it's my roommate's friend. I mean, at that point, I thought Tanya's going to jail, not me.
He tells her to get up and go to the kitchen, where she sees another cop with Joanne.
Her kitchen drawers were emptied, and the policeman with my friend Joanne was going through all the kitchen drawers, had taken out all the kitchen knives, was asking us who were we, what did we do, all sorts of questions. I really can't remember what, but I remember.
Jean and Joanne are English, and they're fumbling their way through panicked answers in French while trying to keep some kind of calm.
I can still see it, her kitchen drawers on top of the kitchen counter when they were looking for who knows what. And then I don't know how long it was. As they walked out the door, I think one of us said something to them and they said, oh, well, some of your neighbors wonder what was going on here. And they walked out.
When Jean revisits the whole fiasco, she's reminded of just how on edge Montreal was at the time.
To the point where little old ladies in a lower class English neighborhood are going to phone the police because they think something's funny. Well, as I told you, little old ladies, I guess now I'm probably a little old lady. They might have even been younger than I am now.
And maybe they were right to keep an eye out. These were the years when tensions between the area's English speakers and working class French Canadians were at a tipping point. In the early 60s, a group of militant French-speaking separatists called the Front de Libération de Quebec, or the FLQ, started planting Molotov cocktails and bombs in mailboxes to bring attention to their call for an independent Quebec.
Okay, maybe the English sort of lorded it over, or the French saying we're superior, and that should not have been. But to work things out with bombs and mailboxes in English neighborhoods, it snowballed, and without real thought or thinking behind it.
Over the years, these acts would escalate. More bombs, 2 kidnappings, and a murder. Until the federal government triggered the War Measures Act and put the military out on the streets. Jean said that those times felt like an overreaction to an overreaction.
Everybody was so tense and so on edge for a couple of years, and nobody did anyone any favors.
Here in America, we are obviously going through some tense times of our own. And I've heard every possible reaction to the political violence of recent years. Like what Jean said, that we're overreacting, or that we're underreacting, or that we're missing the point. The past was worse. It can always get worse. This season on Things That Go Boom, we are starting in Canada. Because 4 years after January 6th, we want and we need to understand our own divide. Why Canada, you ask? Well, I stumbled on this article in Politico, and it said that if things really got bad in the US, it would probably look something like this crisis in Quebec. So our producer Katie hopped on over to Montreal to find out.
Prochaine station, Lionel Groulx.
Is this what we have to look forward to? And well, putting it simply, are things really as bad as we think? I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom.
Hey, it's Luke Burbank, host of the new podcast, Damp January, where every Wednesday in January, I'll be talking to someone about what their deal is with drinking, like the author Gary Steingart, who says, honestly, living a long life is overrated, so why not have another one?
And there's all these doctors telling us that 0 is the best number of drinks to have, but I mean, we're all worked so hard. Neoliberalism really just whips us every day.
Things are going to get damp this January, and everyone's invited. Check out Damp January from Livewire, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Boom producer Katie Toth is on our way to meet Chris Oliveros. He's a famous graphic novelist in Montreal, and he wrote this book on the FLQ, the famous Quebec separatist terror group that threw Canada into crisis and panic in late October of 1970. But Katie's stuck. She's stopped by the warning bells of a train track that have been going off for a good half an hour or so, with no way to cross.
It's a funny coincidence, actually, because Chris, who I'm meeting, he opens his book with a story about how Canada's top train guy basically started the FLQ crisis. It was in 1962, and Donald Gordon kind of lit a fire under the Quebec separatist movement. He was appearing at a routine budget hearing when someone asked him how, being headquartered in Montreal of all places, he could have so few French executives. He gave some classic privileged answer about how he only picks the best and it's affirmative action that's the real problem, even before those words were common parlance. Some students went out in the streets burning an image of Donald Gordon in effigy. Quebecers were mad. And now, 70 years later, I'm mad for this much pettier reason, which is just that this train is nowhere to be seen. I consider making a run for it, but...
Okay, yeah, I just always feel like journalism's never worth it, you know? Like, I don't like to take risks on the job, so, yeah.
The train passes. I meet Chris.
Hi, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks
Sorry
for
you had that
taking the
trouble
time.
over there.
He points to the water beside us and explains there's a reason why the trains are down here.
The Lachine Canal is right over there.
Yeah.
And then up until 1971, the big ships, like the huge ships, would have gone through the canal. And that was the main source of transport, essentially, for so much industry.
The ships and the train tracks met right here in this working-class neighborhood of Saint-Henri, where factory after factory loaded and unloaded goods along the water.
So the rail cars would pick up merchandise as well. And then in these neighborhoods like Saint-Henri, you would have the workers living close by. And then, so all these were very poor neighborhoods. And again, it was mostly Francophone, and the workers would come to work in the factories.
We've come down here to see one spot in front of one factory in particular. He drew it for his book.
This was actually it.
Yeah.
It took 2 or 3 attempts to actually locate the exact spot. Then finally, I went to one of the actual original police reports that the archives have, where you could actually even see the signature of the police officer who signed off on the report. And then I located this alley. I was walking up to this spot, just as we just did now. And as I was approaching this spot, I saw a spot on the ground. At first I thought, is that some kind of strange symbol for like a parking spot, maybe like a handicapped parking spot? And then as I got closer, I started looking at that spot. And I thought, oh my God, they can't be. No, there's no way they did that.
It's a very simple painting in white of a human head and torso, with no arms and no legs.
To commemorate exactly where this poor 16-year-old named Jean Corbeau blew himself up by accident.
Corbeau was going to plant a makeshift bomb outside the factory. These things were not very stable.
It blew up in his hands and it killed him instantly. So you can see this photo shows this side of the wall and like the windows are all blown out.
Lacey Healy here. I just want to jump in real quick because when most people think about the FLQ crisis in Canada, if they think about it or know about it at all, they think about this frenzied month in October of 1970, where Quebec separatists kidnapped a cabinet minister named Pierre Laporte and a British trade diplomat named James Cross. The separatists got their manifesto read on the national broadcaster, killed one of their hostages, and then fled to Cuba. At this time, the streets were full of cops and military servicemen, and the government responded by cracking down on leftists and separatists for years, leading to a long-standing debate in the country about whether the prime minister at the time, Pierre Trudeau, took his response too far. Chris tells Katie that this is what he was going to write about. At least, that's what he thought.
But as soon as I started doing my research, I realized that there's so much in here that's completely fascinating and mostly forgotten.
And one thing that's often forgotten was how amateur it all was.
It was all amateur hour. The funny thing about the FLQ is that there were sort of different waves. What would happen is that the first wave, they would have their plans would get foiled, they would be stopped by the police and thrown in jail. And then maybe a year later, a completely different cell would spring up, like completely unconnected, and they would have their crazy plans.
Crazy plans concocted by angry, idealistic, middle-aged men who pulled in kids looking to believe in something. Like in the first wave, 1963. Recruiters went to a local Italian spot and asked a bunch of teens if they had access to a secret hideout, had any firearms, and were willing to die for the cause.
Which is where I get the title for my book.
Then in the second wave, 1964, a Hungarian immigrant tried to make a camp for guerrilla fighters in the Quebec countryside, thinking they would go head-to-head with the Canadian military. They had 12 people already. He got only 2 new recruits. In the third wave, the Marxist, anti-ruling class vibe that had been percolating became way more explicit, and the separatists started targeting sites of exchange and industry, like the Montreal Stock Exchange in 1969, and just a few years earlier, the factory where we saw the end of 16-year-old Jean Corbeau.
During my research for this book on the FLQ, I've realized that this sort of incompetence and this bungling, if you will, was not exclusive to the FLQ. In fact, many revolutionary movements in the world had exactly this type of bungling. The Weather Underground in the United States was very much like this. There's not many revolutionary movements where things went smoothly and according to plan.
It sounds like it doesn't necessarily take a perfect plan or a lot of people or even a lot of super organized people to create a lot of instability.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the funny thing is that throughout this movement, throughout the 7 years of the FLQ from 1963 to 1970, the authorities, meaning like the government and the police and the RCMP and so on, never quite knew how many people were involved. And at one point, they thought there could potentially be thousands, literally thousands of people involved in this movement. Now, the funny thing is that after everything was said and done, it turns out that with each of these different waves, there were never more than a dozen or two. Literally, there were, at the height of this movement, there were maybe 12 or 14 people involved. You could actually, you would always have, almost always have, really small groups of people that could actually create a lot of havoc.
Prochaine station, Place des Arts.
That havoc is something Liz Morgan experienced firsthand.
We had a beautiful house. It was built by my grandfather, and it had a bird tower for, what were they called, the pigeons? The white, beautiful fantail pigeons. They'd been there for 100 years, I guess, by then. We woke up one morning, not to the sound of the birds cooing. Their necks had all been strangled, and somebody had gone up in the tower and just killed them all.
Today, Liz Morgan lives a short drive from that beautiful house she grew up in. She runs an organic farm outside of Montreal, and she's come downtown to bring her friend some fresh garlic today. But Liz is also the product of a department store empire. She's standing in front of the flagship store that belonged to her family, Morgan's, before the chain was sold to Hudson's Bay Company in 1960.
And all the red stone came in the bottom of ships as ballast from Scotland, because they were from Scotland. They used to be a store on St. Paul Street and later on Victoria Square. There was a big flood in the 1800s and it caused a lot of damage, so they moved up the hill. And was considered to be a crazy move. And then Burke's talked to my grandfather, great-grandfather.
Burke's is a big jewelry house in Canada.
And said, why are you doing this? And he said to be close to the customers that are in the Golden Square Mile. So they thought it was the sort of the beginning of the move of the downtown core.
Her great-grandparents, they were right.
Yeah, they were right. Yeah.
A century later, when Liz was a kid in her 20s, Montreal was a city with a lot of riz.
The futuristic shapes of the pavilions were rising against the sky. The sharp thrusting lines of the A-shaped steel pavilion as well.
The International and Universal Exposition, or Expo, had just come through in 1967. The city was building a huge subway system, which would become a point of pride for decades. And that subway was also a constant source of supply for the FLQ because there was dynamite all over town that wasn't locked up. And maybe that gets at the crux of what was happening here a bit. This was the city where you wanted to be. It was also a site of radical politics and big social changes. Quebec was moving away from the church. It was building a social welfare system. And Montreal was home to increasingly militant tactics that put a target on Liz's back. When Canada sent in the military to respond to the FLQ, Liz could see the army from her family's apartment across from the Ritz.
It was a very scary time.
But before soldiers started marching through the streets, the FLQ put Quebec's richest families in its crosshairs, which meant being the Morgans, as in the Morgans whose name was on the store, was even more scary. The FLQ had specifically named her family as the kind of Anglophones they would be making an example of. It didn't matter that her mom was French.
I felt, because my mother was French-Canadian, that I had French blood in me, that we would be immune. Obviously not. So the family got together and told my brother and I that if we were kidnapped, the policy was not to pay rewards, which wasn't the greatest feeling, but that was what we were supposed to understand, which wasn't very helpful.
We walk over to the old mall where at one point, Liz even found herself being followed, just up the street from where we're standing now.
I was visiting a friend in Place Ville-Marie at Streeter and Corals and had the sense that I was being followed, which is an eerie feeling in itself. And I thought I might be imagining it. So I went into the store and found my friend and said, I've got this really weird feeling that I'm being followed. So I took something and went into the back room, the changing room, and she surveyed the scene and came back to me and said, yes, there's somebody there. So I left through a back door, and I was like feeling like I was in a spy movie or something, but got into my car and started heading home and felt that I was being followed by cars. Anyway, I went through back streets of Westmount over the mountain, and I think I lost them.
To Liz, it seemed clear. Someone was out there taking some legitimate grievances and torquing those grievances to send a dangerous message.
You know, it was understandable that there was a feeling against the English, and it just somehow wasn't resolved. But as in any case of violence, it's usually propagated by not the people who have started the problem or the questioning. It's the thugs that join any peaceful demonstration or protest that warp the true meaning of what's being tried.
But that violence, Chris says, it failed. And it wasn't just because of their ragtag approach to revolution, but because Quebecers were already thinking about a different path to power. That's coming up after the break.
Prochaine station, à toi terre.
Chris and Katie are walking up the hill to Westmount, the English neighborhood full of titans of industry who, back in the day, could literally look down on the working class of St. Henri who lived below them.
It's symbolic also for being at the height of power. It was what the FLQ wanted to overthrow. It symbolized everything that they wanted to overthrow. There's a stop sign over here. We're at the back of it, so you can't see the front. What's unusual about this stop sign is that on the stop sign, it has the word stop. I know that seems totally normal, except in everywhere else in Quebec, a stop sign has the word arrêt. This is one of the only places in all of Quebec. There might be a couple other neighborhoods in Montreal that has a just stop, and maybe another handful might have two, like both.
Stop arrêt.
Yeah. So that's actually, a remnant of that English dominance.
By the early 1960s, these stop signs were a constant visual reminder of the city's economic and cultural disparities. The French and the new immigrants work. The old Anglophone moneyed class siphons off the profit. The FLQ argued that violent action was the only solution. They saw Quebec's future in socialism, and they thought that the only way that Quebec could get to socialism was without English Canada on its back. But while the FLQ was regrouping for its third most violent wave, others in the community were asking how to make change at the ballot box.
It's about time we make up our minds. There's been a continuing crisis about the status of Quebec and about where the hell we go from there.
Let me bring you to 1968, when an edgy young statesman, René Lévesque, starts the Parti Québécois. This is the moment that eventually will create another option for Quebec, a path out of crisis. 2 years later, Lévesque's party is up and running for its first provincial election. In this clip, you can hear that he's pretty nervous. He isn't so sure how he'll fare with the electoral system.
It could be a huge popular vote and not enough seats, which would be dangerous because this creates a sort of frustration.
And that's exactly what happened in 1970. The Parti Québécois got only 7 of the province's 125 seats, despite having more than 20% of the vote. FLQ militants, they turned around and said, look, this is proof. Democracy doesn't work.
Public sympathy was growing from the early 60s up until 1970, and it culminated in what happened in October 1970.
So after 8 years of failed attempts at revolution, the FLQ goes big. Political kidnappings.
They were actually directly influenced by revolutionary movements in South America, in particular in Brazil, in Uruguay, and in Argentina.
While René Lévesque calls the FLQ terrorists sewer rats, he does not hesitate to point out that the social conditions of Quebec created these people.
The FLQ captures 2 people at gunpoint, a British trade diplomat and the popular Quebec minister, Pierre Laporte.
While there appears to be almost universal condemnation for the use of violence, particularly the kidnappings, there is on the streets of East End Montreal a tacit understanding and acceptance of what the FLQ is doing. I won't say I'm for and I won't say I'm against. is not infrequently heard.
And some people weren't just staying out of it. They were even cheering from the sidelines.
Support exists among the 200 to 300 members of the Mouvement de la Libération de Taxi, a group which itself has indulged in violence more than once. The St. Henri Workers' Committee in the slums of Montreal hangs FLQ posters in its windows. Observers at the University of Quebec say the majority of students favor the FLQ's action.
The FLQ started negotiating for their statements to be read on public television and for free passage to Cuba. And then, somewhere along the way, one of their hostages, Pierre Laporte, was strangled by the chain around his neck.
They didn't intend to kill their hostages, but it's unclear whether he was strangled while he broke the window, tried to escape, and maybe he kind of like his chain got stuck, or his captors actually decided to kill him. It's also unclear because his captors made a pact amongst themselves. When they were questioned, okay, which one of you did it? They said, we all did it. In fact, even one of them who was not there, he said, they basically said, yeah, I did. And the next guy said, I did. There's one of them who's still alive, but to this day, he's still not revealing what exactly happened.
That moment, it completely changed how people saw the FLQ.
There was shock and horror and revulsion, and people all of a sudden didn't want to support that. The objectives were still there. They still wanted to change this oppressive system, but not by means of violence.
Alexandre Turgeon, a historian at Laval University in Quebec, agrees. And he says that when Quebec recoiled from violence, they still had somewhere else to go, a political route. Stuff like protesting, marching in the street, and, yes, voting.
On the one hand, you had the FLQ choosing political violence to achieve their goal. But at the same time, you had Parti Québécois, a political party founded on the idea that independence was to be achieved, was to be reached through democratic means, through democracy, through a referendum. So it was a very young party that could have been wiped out right there because of the October crisis. But at the end of the day, Quebecers, they went not for the political violence option, but for the democratic option.
Quebec still has one of the country's biggest social safety nets. Free or cheap college, depending on what you study, more social assistance than the other big provinces for people with disabilities. The leftists made a mark. To be fair, Alexandre doesn't want to simplify this too much. After the October crisis, the state's crackdown on political activists, even peaceful ones, were intense.
I would not say that FLQ helped the cause. The cause of Quebec or the fight or the project in itself. In a way, it did quite the opposite.
Canadian National Police continued to follow and surveil Quebec independence activists for decades.
Still, they won the election into the general election in 1976, 6 years later. And they did not win the first and the second referendum on sovereignty. But they still became a major player to this day in the political life of Quebec.
According to Peter Graefe at McGill University, federal governments also repeatedly took notice of nationalist success in Quebec.
The Canadian government was also aware that if the Quebec government did all these things for the Francophone majority, that majority would likely come and see Quebec as their one and only government, and would likely make some form of separatism increasingly popular. If that was a government that delivered the goods, then what's the point of this other national government? And so there were moves, too, at the federal level to improve the presence of Francophones in the Canadian Federal Service, to make the use of the French language stronger within the federal government, but also in a number of national institutions. I don't know if it sold a great deal, but it certainly reduced the idea that Canada was in some sort of hostile relationship between the federal government and Quebec.
After the crisis of 1970, Quebec would go on to have 2 referendums over whether it should become an independent country. Both happened peacefully, and both times, people voted no.
I think if you have the ability to continue talking and that conversation is actually productive, it doesn't always have to be amicable. And in some cases, in fact, it's very heated and the people at the table hate each other. But nevertheless, if they feel that they can gain something from talking, then chances are they aren't going to be making use of force. If we look over the 50 years since the October crisis, Canada and Quebec, for a large part of it, have been locked in really tough constitutional conflicts. But nevertheless, through the fact of having these ongoing negotiations and this ongoing conflict, but a conflict that's been played out peacefully and politically and through elections, there's a way in which it wears down some of the harder edges.
But that leaves one question unanswered. We decided to report this episode about Canada because we wondered, in the wake of January 6th, could we see something like the FLQ in the US? But as it turns out, none of the experts that we spoke to seemed to think that was a very good question.
I don't think it's the greatest analogy between the two situations.
Not for the same reasons, not on the same level, not the same scope.
January 6th, it was coming from the top, right? This wasn't like a few guys in their basement or wherever planning these things out. I mean, like, with January 6th, if it wasn't coming from the top, it probably would not have happened. It was encouraged and instigated every step of the way.
Each of them had their own rationale for cautioning us against making a one-to-one comparison with such a different political situation. But Peter Graefe said that one of the biggest differences was what people were trying to accomplish.
The situation in Quebec was really framed around the idea of the anti-colonial struggles of the 1950s and 1960s. And Quebec nationalists, whether they were of the FLQ persuasion or those who were working through democratic politics, looked to the national liberation movements of places in Africa in particular, but also in Latin America, to make sense of what they were doing. And so what they were engaged in was really about trying to ensure the rule of the majority within their society. I think that's quite different from stories of militias in the right. I think there's a difference in terms of the ideologies they hold, whether they're democratic or anti-democratic. In many of the recent American situations, it's groups that fear losing power that are trying to use force or the threat of force to maintain their grip on power. I think there's also a significant difference in the extent to which you have the presence of many people with military and paramilitary training in some of these movements in the United States, which compares to just a handful of people who are involved in these terrorist cells with much less training and access to weaponry. I think it makes it harder to think how you would respond to it.
As for Alexandre Turgeon, the main reason he didn't want to draw parallels is that even though over the years the FLQ killed 8 people, injured many more, and drew armed soldiers into the streets, violence is part of the American DNA.
In a way, the October crisis is a blip in our narrative. Whereas I wouldn't call what has happened or what is happening right now as a blip in the American political and mediatic landscape. There's also the scope. The FLQ was only a few dozens individuals. So it was a very smaller scope. Whereas I don't think we can call that in the US right now. You have so many people involved in different levels. QAnon kind of brought a new element in the last 10 years or so, or less than 10 years, but in the last years at the very least.
Peter does say that there might be a lesson here for America from the conflict that once drove quiet Canada to the brink.
Maybe the lesson a bit out of the October crisis is that it's the people around them. That when there's supportive constituencies, it's easier for those groups to act. But when those people actually see that there's a point in participating in the system or feel their grievances are being dealt with in other ways, those who are pushing more violent solutions are left alone, and that undermines their own self-confidence in the acts that they're taking.
Just keeping the conversation going, talking to terrorists, militants, and political extremists, it's a tactic that's been used a lot, including in hostage situations. And it's ended so many conflicts, from Ireland's Good Friday Agreement in 1998 to Sri Lanka's peace with the Tamils in 2002. But as we see a new wave of right-wing political power with groups that are bigger, better trained, funded, and, of course, significantly armed, not everyone thinks that this is the relevant lesson we should be taking into the next few years.
We missed a cultural moment where there was much more space to have productive conversations. One of the things that stood out to me, for example, when I was talking to militia guys in the 2008, 2012 period was a lot of them would really openly talk about how they weren't entirely opposed to gun control, for example. They saw room for discussion around specific boundaries. But we've become so politicized since then that it's hard to reinitiate those conversations. And some of the ability to jump right into those conversations is much harder, even in some longstanding relationships, I think.
That's our next episode of Things That Go Boom. Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. This episode was produced by Katie Toth and me and edited by Christina Stella. Our music is composed by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise makes our show sound its very best. Thanks to our supporters, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as the Colomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We'll see you right back here in 2 weeks.
Fairmont or Saint-Viateur bagel?
I'm a Fairmount bagel person because that's where I went first and where they had cheaper day-old bagels through my undergraduate days. That's what I could afford. So I'm a Fairmount bagel, but I realize that makes me a man of poor taste.
From PRX.